So glad that you are here. Galatians chapter 5, we'll pick it up at verse 7, and you can see here where I've got the chapter broken up into three different sections. And we covered verses 1 through 6 already. Tonight we will look at stay in your lane, which is verses 7 through 15. We'll get that right there. And stay in your lane. Now, Paul is talking to the Galatians about can you hear it? It sounds like it's just getting ready to explode and make your ears bleed, huh? Like, get some feedback and your eardrums will explode. But Paul is wanting the Galatians to understand that they're already, if they're saved, if they're Christians, they're already free in Christ. They don't need to jump through the hoops and do all kinds of religious activity and follow the Old Testament law in order to be saved. They don't have to do those things in order to be righteous. They're already saved. They already have the righteousness of Christ. And so Paul is wanting them to understand that. He continues that into chapter 5 and 6 and into our section here. And he tells them to stay in your lane. Now, the reason that I picked that title, Stay in Your Lane, for this section is found in verse 7. He says here, you ran well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? So notice just the plain reading of it and the question that he's asking. He says, you ran well, but who hindered you from obeying the truth? Who's keeping you from obeying the truth? Now that would be the false teachers. We called them Judaizers, okay? But the false teachers that were trying to get the Galatians to believe differently than what they had originally believed. But the reason I said stay in your lane is because the word hindered there, now you notice in verse 7, he starts out by saying, you ran well. Past tense, you ran well. He says, who hindered you? It's actually an athletic idea that he's using there, or picture that he's using. When he says you ran well, he's saying you were in the race, you were running, you were doing really well. When he says who hindered you, the word hindered actually means this. It actually conveys the idea that you were in your lane running your race. Now, some of us are runners. I said some of us. I am no longer a runner. I used to run. I don't do that anymore. Because why? And some of you are runners. I know that we have some of you that compete. You're competitive in high school, and that's what you do. You're on the track team or whatever. I know that in cross country there are no lanes, but in track you get lanes. That's the picture here. Is an individual who's running in their lane, and when he uses the word hindered, what he means is he's actually asking the question, who left their lane, crossed over into your lane, and knocked you out of your lane? Okay? So that's the idea. That's the reason why we said stay in your lane. Because he's telling the Galatians here in verse 7, he says, listen, you got to get back into your lane and continue the race. You allowed somebody to come in, leave their lane, bump into you, and knock you out of your lane and knock you out of the race. He says you got to get back in your lane, stay in that lane, and run your race. That's what he's saying there. So you ran well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? And what I put was, for verse 7, was cut off. Who cut you off? Now, I am familiar with cross country, those of you that run cross country. The starting lane is absolute chaos. You got your team, you're all lined up, you're ready to go, you're waiting for the gun. That gun goes off, man. And there could be, if it's at an invitational, I mean, there could be hundreds of other runners out there with you on that course taking off at the same time. Gun goes off. Everybody's trying to funnel down into one lane. You got elbows flying, you got people tripping, you're hurdling the dead, and leaving them behind, and trying to get, through the crowd, and trying to stay on your feet and hold your position. The idea is, even in cross country, you're getting cut off constantly. You can do that in cross country. In fact, you better do that. Coach will be yelling at you from the side, like, get him, catch him, cut him off, or whatever. That's the idea. And what he's saying here is that these false teachers have actually left their lane, they cut you off and knocked you out of the race. So he's saying, why would you do that? Get back in the lane, get in your lane, and keep moving forward. Now, the next thing he does in verse 8 is, he says this persuasion does not come from him who calls you. This persuasion, I called that carried away. Why did I call it carried away in verse 8? Here's why. Because the word persuasion can either be good or bad. You can be persuaded to do something good. People are persuaded all of the time not to take their own lives. That's a good kind of persuasion. You know, all of us have seen videos of some individual, maybe that's up on a bridge or something, or they're getting ready to do harm to themselves or someone else. And maybe a police officer or somebody else comes along and they're able to persuade them not to do that. That's a good kind of persuasion. This kind of persuasion is not a good kind of persuasion. It actually means a treacherous or deceptive persuasion. So the Galatians are being carried away. They're being deceived or persuaded. This would be the idea of somebody that's like, selling them something, that they don't really need, and they're carried away by that. Some of us like to shop, right? And you go to the store, and maybe you're looking for something, and maybe a salesperson comes along, and I think that this will look really great on you, or whatever. They start with all their flattery, this would really compliment your physique, or your shape, or your color, or your whatever, and they want to try and get you to like buy all of their goods. They're trying to get you to pay their monthly rent is what they're trying to do, and trying to get you to. They're trying to persuade you. And maybe they don't really think all of those things about you. They're just trying to make some money. That's the idea, is that these false teachers actually persuaded the Galatians away from following Jesus, just plain and simple. This persuasion does not come from him who calls you. Now, there's a little clue here. I'm going to point it out, and then we're going to move on. But remember last week, those of you that were here last week, we talked about how some of those verses, it kind of sounded like Paul was saying, hey man, you Galatians, you're not even saved anymore. You started following the Old Testament law and now you're not even saved. But then I explained that, no, that's not what Paul's saying. Paul believes that the Galatians, even in their foolishness of trying to follow the law or trying to be legalists, Paul still believes that these people are Christians. Notice in verse 8, little clue there. He says, this persuasion does not come from him who calls you. So Paul believes in verse 8 that God he's still calling the Galatians. He's not given up on them. He's still calling them. Now, in verse 9, he goes on to say this, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And so Paul is using these different pictures to explain what he's trying to say. And I like this, these word pictures. Verse 9, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. It's got to be a C, corrupted. Verse 9. He says these false teachers have corrupted you. Now the word leaven, what is that? Some of us know what leaven is. We're familiar with that. Leaven, what is it, Joaquin?
It's like the substance you put in bread that gives it like its lumps, and like for example like French bread has lots of that.
Yes, French bread, right? It rises. You put leaven in there and it rises. It makes the dough rise. You remove the leaven and it stays flat, like a tortilla, right? Some beans and cheese in there, we have a little bit of rice, whatever, however you like it. But it's flat. And now the reason he's using the word leaven is because, again, now Paul's not just throwing things out there. There's a method to his madness. These Galatians, okay, whether they were originally Jews or they were originally Gentiles, which just means they weren't Jews, they're now reverting back to Judaism. And in Judaism, leaven and unleavened is a big deal. Okay, there are the Feast of Passover, and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You've got to have bread that's not leavened, and so Paul is using that, and Paul's aware of that. He's a Jew, but he's using that picture of leaven to use with the Galatians, who just happen to be getting all caught up in all that Old Testament stuff. Leaven being one of them, and so he says, "Listen, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. You just needed a little bit." Put that, mix that in with your dough, and it affects the entire bunch of dough. What is he saying? He's saying that these guys, these false teachers, they're injecting little bits of information into you, and you're taking it and it's blowing up, it's expanding, and that's no good. That's not a good thing. When you go back to the Old Testament and you find out about some of the Passover and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread immediately following that, you find out that leaven is not a good thing in those cases, and that leaven actually represents sin back in the Old Testament, well, throughout the Bible. And so when he says here that a little leaven leavens the whole lump, he's telling the Galatians that, listen, you've got that little bit of legalism injected into you. You're receiving it, and it's affecting everyone. It's affecting you. It's affecting everyone around you. And that's what happens when we get caught up in what we call legalism. In other words, I've got to, in order to be righteous or closer to God, I have to go back to the Old Testament. I've got to read through all those laws, and I've got to start doing all of those things. And if I do all of those correctly, then I will be closer to God. I'll be in a better position with God. And what Paul wants them to understand is, man, you don't have to do that. You're already in a great position with God. You've already got the righteousness of Christ. You're not getting any closer to God because you're already as close as you can get. You're in a relationship with Him. He loves you. So there's no like earning spots and trying to jockey for positions and, you know what, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to get over, I'm going to get over Suarez, man, if I can just serve a little bit more or follow the law or whatever. And no, there are no degrees. There are no levels. It's been said that at the foot of the cross, meaning when you're in a relationship with God, when you're in a relationship with Jesus, it's all even. Nobody's higher than anybody else. It's not how it works. Pastor Chris isn't closer to God because, he teaches the Bible, he studies the Bible, and he teaches the Bible. All of us have equal access to God. All of us have a relationship with God. And there's no differences there. So a little leaven leavens the whole lump, he says. Now, in verses 10 and 11, he's got confidence in them, but look what he says, he's careful. He says, I have confidence in you, in the Lord, he throws in there. Those three little words, in the Lord. He wants the Galatians to know, I'm confident in you, well, in the Lord, really, but, as he's working in you is what he's saying. I have confidence in you, in the Lord, that you will have no other mind. In other words, Paul says, listen, Galatians, my friends, I'm confident that you're going to listen to me, that you're going to reason, that you're going to receive what I'm saying. He says, but he who troubles you, that's the false teachers, shall bear his judgment, whoever he is. Paul's almost like, I'm not worried about that individual, the false teacher. I'm concerned with you, Galatians. I want you to understand. I've a lot of you know that I've got kids. I have 4 kids. Now they're not kids anymore. They're now childish adults. Adult children. They're older. But I've told them for a long time. When they were younger, going through high school. I know you guys don't understand this at all. But when they were in high school, sometimes they would, they'd start hooking up with the wrong kind of friends and, that kind of stuff, right? I know you guys don't do that. But my kids did at times. And there were times when I would tell them, look, I want to talk to you. We need to talk about what's going on. Have a seat, let's talk. And I would explain to them, this and that, here's my concerns. But I would always point out that, I don't know what your friend is doing. It's not my job to go chase your friend down and wag my finger at your friend and you better not do that. I said, my concern is with you. You're my son, you're my daughter. So my concern is with you. Paul's telling them that. He's like, hey, the troublemaker, the false teacher, he's going to face God's judgment. Paul says, I'm concerned with you, Galatians. He's like Galatians, you're like my children, and I'm concerned with you. Verse 11, being confident, he says, and I, brethren, if I still preach circumcision, why do I still suffer persecution? What's that all about? Sounds like Paul was being accused of teaching legalism. That's what he means by circumcision. He says, somebody said that I'm preaching that stuff. But if I was preaching that, why would I be suffering persecution? And he means, why would I be suffering persecution from the Jews? If I was teaching Judaism, they wouldn't be against me. But look what he says in verse 11. Then the offense of the cross has ceased. Now, the offense of the cross, what does he mean that has ceased? He's like, what he's saying is, if I was teaching Judaism and legalism and the law, then I wouldn't be persecuted from the Jews. And then the cross, the preaching of Jesus dying on the cross, it wouldn't offend anybody because I wouldn't be telling anybody. So Paul's point is that I'm stuck on Jesus, man. I'm stuck on Jesus, and I'm stuck on teaching people and showing people that Jesus died on a Roman cross. So Paul, he's not changed. He's still preaching Jesus. Now in verse 12 here, we've got again cut off. I know I've got it twice because this is a different meaning here. In the first one, verse 7, the idea was the false teachers were cutting off the Galatians and pushing them off the race course. Here in verse 12, I believe that it's a play on words. I'm going to show you. Verse 12. Paul says, I could wish that those who trouble you, that's the false teachers, would even cut themselves off. Now here's what I believe Paul is saying. Earlier in the chapter, last week, those of you that were here, he mentioned circumcision. Okay? Again, he just mentioned it in verse 11. If I was still preaching circumcision, okay? In case you weren't here last week, let me just explain to you briefly. Circumcision was a ritual or a rite of passage, so to speak, for the Jews. All of the males had to be circumcised. All of the male children had to be circumcised. It is, and if you don't know what that is, God bless you. It means it's a minor surgery that can only be performed on males. Okay? It was a cutting off of skin is what it was. And so Paul, as he's talking to the Galatians and saying, hey, don't, because the Judaizers were actually saying, well, listen, in order to be saved, in order to be right with God, you got to go back and practice the law again, but you got to start with circumcision. You got to be circumcised. And Paul, last week, he told them, circumcision does not avail, and it's not going to do you any good. You can be circumcised or uncircumcised. It doesn't have anything to do with your relationship with God. So I hope you all understand that. That outward appearance, and I think we need to be careful with, our outward appearance. But the truth is that if you're good looking, or not so much, I think you're all beautiful, okay, by the way, okay? Most of you. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not looking at anyone. No, I'm just kidding. A beautiful bunch of people. But here's the deal. Regardless of your outward appearance, hair color, skin color, size of your nose, size of your ears, you got biceps or you don't have biceps or whatever, your physique or how fast you go. None of that does anything to get you any closer to God or any further from God. It really doesn't affect that relationship at all. Paul wants them to understand this. That the outward appearance, man, it's really just outward appearance. That's all it is. So he was talking about that circumcision. And saying, listen, circumcised is just an outward thing. It really doesn't commend you to God. So when he gets to verse 12, he actually says this. He says, I wish that those who troubled you would even cut themselves off. I think what Paul is saying here is he's saying, I wish the false teachers would just circumcise themselves like out of your life. Just cut themselves off out of your life. That's what he's saying. I just want them to be gone, be out of here. Cut themselves off. Now, verse 13 and 14, we see here that they're called to liberty. For you, brethren or brothers, and I think it's safe to add sisters in there too. Don't think that, well, it's just for the guys. For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Again, Paul believes that they're saved. And so he says, you've been called to liberty, freedom. Only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh. Now, we get a quick lesson on what this liberty or freedom is for. If I don't need to live and eat legalism, I don't need to go back and follow the Old Testament law in order to be righteous. You're telling me I'm already righteous because of my relationship with Jesus. I'm free. Okay. What happens oftentimes is that Christians will go, man, I'm free. I guess I got the freedom to do whatever I want, live however I want. And they'll start exercising those freedoms. I've seen it lots of times over the years with Christians a little bit older than you who all of a sudden, man, they start posting their pictures of them, at the pizza place with their mug of beer, drinking. Or yeah, we went to the bar last night, we had so I didn't get drunk though, because the Bible says don't be drunk with wine. So I didn't get drunk, but and the truth is that scripturally I can't say, hey, man, you can't be drinking, because that's not what the Bible says. The Bible does say do not be drunk with wine. But what I see, and maybe you've seen it too, is an individual who's exercising their liberty, their freedom, but they're doing it just in the face of every other Christian. Like, well, I've got this freedom, and forget you, and if if there's a Christian who used to struggle with alcohol, well, forget you, because I've got a freedom now, and I can do this if I want. And that becomes the attitude. And Paul is saying, no, that's not what freedom's for. Look what he says: only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh being the sinful part of me. He says, don't use this freedom that you have just to serve yourself. That's not what freedom's for. And then he tells us what freedom is for. Verse 13, but through love, serve one another. That's what my freedom is for. My freedom is meant for the service of others. And you go, that's not freedom? Why would I use my freedom to go serve other people? Look, you do not understand. You do not understand that our purpose as Christians is to serve others, to serve the Lord as we're serving other people. And you will never be completely satisfied as long as you focus on serving yourself. You will never be satisfied. Now, some of you will believe me when I say that. Maybe you've tasted that. You've served other people and you go, no, serving other people, that's where it's at. But there are some of you in here tonight that are going to be like, what do you know, old man? Please. I spent the first 20 years of my life serving myself. That's what I did. And at the end of it, I had nothing to show for it. Nothing. I was miserable, empty, lonely. All I can do is tell you, all I can do is share that with you. That if you will commit yourself to serving other people, all of a sudden you're going to find fulfillment. If you have found yourself kind of wandering through life and like, man, I'm a Christian, but I'm just not happy, and I don't know, it just doesn't seem like I'm playing this sport, but I don't know, that's just not doing it. And I joined this club, and that's not really doing it either. And I got this group of friends, and that's not really doing it either. And I went to this party, and that's just not really doing it either. And I'm doing this stuff, but I don't know. It's just my heart's not settled. Well, it might be because you're trying to serve yourself in all these different ways. And serving yourself, it's never going to be enough. Never going to be enough. I mean, how many singers, actors have taken their own lives because they were so unsatisfied, so empty? Countless. And why is that? Because they were serving themselves, and they couldn't serve themselves enough. They were miserable, and they just finally decided that this is horrible. I don't want to do this anymore. And they didn't know any better, and they took their own lives. They didn't have Jesus. But you and I have to understand that the liberty that we have is meant to be used through love, serving one another. You and I should be serving one another. Verse 14, for all the law is fulfilled. Now, he brings up the law because Paul knows the law. And these Galatians who are trying to follow the law, they know the law now. He says, let me remind you of something in the law, since you want to talk about the law. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this. He quotes from Leviticus 19:18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. That means love the people around you. Now, this is be honest, okay? TBH. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Look, let's just be, I'll be the one. I'll be the one, okay? We love ourselves. We are in love with ourselves, okay? In love with ourselves. I mean, I want you to think about this for a minute, because this is radical. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, love your neighbor the same way that you love yourself. Can you imagine? You have to get up extra early because you go in the bathroom and you love yourself by getting yourself all dolled up. And then you're like, hey, Mom, Dad, I'll be back. Where are you going? I'm going to love the neighbor next door. And you go help him or her get themselves all dolled up. Like, oh, no, let's say, not a big deal. Like, hey, wake up. Come on, we got to get you dressed. Can you imagine? Like, that's so what I'm saying is this is it's nigh impossible for us because man, we love ourselves so much. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The same way that I love myself, I'm supposed to love the people around me. Ooh. Okay? We need to work on that one. We need to work on that one. But the point that he's making is the freedom that we have is meant for serving other people. And when you use that liberty, that freedom to serve other people, you're going to find yourself satisfied. And when you use that liberty to serve yourself, you're going to find yourself so unsatisfied. And we got one more verse here, verse 15, before we finish. And it is a caution, verse 15. Look at that. All those beautiful C's on there. Love it. But if you bite and devour one another, beware. There's the caution, verse 15. Beware lest you be consumed by one another. What's he talking about now? Paul using all these strange metaphors. Like, what is he talking about? If you bite and devour one another, be careful so that, or you're going to end up eating each other? What is he talking about? Here's the point that he's making. When an individual or a group of individuals gets caught up in legalism, in other words, you know what? I'm following the Old Testament laws. I from now on, I'm only reading the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's it. I'm going to commit myself to that. I'm going to follow the law there. I'm only observing Sabbaths. I don't go to church on Sundays anymore. I only eat these foods, and I do these sacrifices and all these other things. Okay? Let me tell you what happens. Again, because I've seen it. And maybe you've seen it. What happens is, when you and I get wrapped up in that, now I've got something to measure. Okay? Now I've got something to measure. Now, if I'm following the law, and Elijah's following the law, now I can measure his life. And I can go, oh, I noticed you didn't pray. I prayed. And what that does is it gives me that little boost, man, in my ego. Like oh, wait, Elijah's right here. But I just leapfrogged him because, I followed the law. But then I'm watching him, and maybe he does his sacrifice, or he does his whatever, and then it's like, oh, he's gaining on me. I got to do something, and then it's always this competition. If you and I get caught up in legalism, wagging our fingers at one another, like, hey, you're not supposed to be doing that, whatever, and we're all caught up, and you're not really, you're not following the law. Well, following the law gives me the ability to now measure, because I can go, well, I followed 8 of the 10 commandments today. How many did you do? Oh, 7? Okay. Oh, well, I mean, it's pretty good, but it's not 8, right? Now I have some leverage, man. Now I've got something like I can, I've got something I can measure my righteousness with. That's what he's saying. He's saying, Galatians, if you're doing this with one another and you're like all caught up in the law, he says, if you bite, oh, drop that phone you weren't supposed to have, huh? How embarrassing. But if you bite and devour one another, beware. Twice, like in the last month, Matt was praying, and I get up secretly because I'm trying to get myself ready as Matt's praying. I'm supposed to be praying. Okay, I get up and I'm trying to get all my stuff to the mic, to the stand, and I'm walking up and then I just like freeze, like I wasn't moving, I was always getting caught. But if you bite and devour one another, you get all caught up in legalism. You start devouring one another, and he says, caution, because you're going to end up just absolutely obliterating one another. I mean, that's the way that you get a church to shrink, man. Is every time you come in here, we don't say, hey, it's good to see you. We go, oh, you're wearing that tonight, huh? Well, I mean, imagine if every time you came in here on a Wednesday night, we were judging you. The leaders, line up and look at you. Oh, I saw what you posted on Instagram. Oh, okay. Well, imagine. Would you come back? No, you would not come back. You're here because you find love here. It's not perfect love, but you know that we love you. And so you get the love, you get the Bible studies, you get the worship, you get all that stuff, and you keep coming back. We're not, do we love each other enough, all of us, not just leaders, but even you guys, do we love each other enough that we help keep each other in check and like, hey, dude, I saw, you were doing this or doing that. Hey, you just want to be careful, whatever. You know what I mean? Like, we do that, but we're not here to judge one another and measure one another and, you're not doing this right. Man, this is a hospital, right? That's what a church is. It's a hospital. And all of us here, we're in the recovery. We're trying to, we're helping one another out. That's what we're doing here. And when the church works that way, then there's no biting and devouring and consuming one another. Then, when we're all focused on Jesus, man, then we're loving one another, we're serving one another. That's the way that it should be. Father, thank you so much.